Hi, my name is Kamilah Mercedes Valentin Diaz, and I form part of the Puerto Rican diaspora. I've decided to focus on Puerto Rico as part of my hometown project. Puerto Rico has limited autonomy and no legitimate claim to self determination. This lack of power over their economic, political, and social spheres has caused the island's poor infrastructure, fostered an environment for corrupt politicians, and has virtually tied its hands when it comes to responding to any disaster they might face. Currently, the entire world is combating the insurmountable disaster that is the coronavirus pandemic. This project will be framed by the pandemic and focus on Puerto Rico's inability to adequately protect itself from spreading the virus and ensuring a lower death toll due to its status as a colony. This discussion and analysis will cover some of the reasons why the United States does not allow Puerto Rico to make these decisions. It will assess the level of exploitations Puerto Rico has been submitted to and at what cost. I wanted to open with this image you see above because it is an overview of the awakening that occurred during the mass protests that I attended in the summer of 2019 in Puerto Rico, which called for the resignation of the then governor Ricardo Rosselló, a feat which we achieved. Rosselló was viewed as complacent to Puerto Rico's exploitation and faced a scandal after a chat leaked where he made fun of deaths of Hurricane Maria, joked about assassinating the mayor of San Juan, amongst other things. In the image, a woman stands in the midst of protests. Painted on her is the Puerto Rican flag. Barbed wire covers her mouth into silence while she weeps.
This is a photo I took during the 2019 summer protests. My sisters and I were in Indianapolis when they began. We were keeping track of them through the news and social media outlets. When they announced Un Paro Nacional, which is a national stop, we all decided we had to be there for it. That same night, we bought our plane tickets and decided to use our voice and privilege as part of the diaspora to incite change. The Paro Nacional was meant to completely put a stop on all things on the island until the governor was forced to resign. We closed one of the main highways in the capital of San Juan. In the photo, you can see two people who have scaled the hanging road signs and placed a black and white version of the Puerto Rican flag over the sign. This flag is linked to many movements of protest and independence on and off the island. This is a video I took of my abuelo during the protest with my older sister Gabriela. The smile on his face is one of pride. He usually doesn't smile when he knows he's being recorded. He's a proud man and an independentista who never thought he would get to see the day that Puerto Ricans of all ages would mobilize in such an intense way. He often tells me that he knows he will not live to see a free Puerto Rico, but that he hopes I will. This is another photo I took as the day progressed. This area was blocked off not only by people, but by personal equipment like semi-trucks, construction tools, and regular pickup trucks. Hurricane Maria hit the island of Puerto Rico on September 2017. The response to this natural disaster was even more disastrous. Here I have a snapshot of a tweet by Donald J. Trump that reads, "The mayor of San Juan, who was very complimentary only a few days ago, has now been told by the Democrats that you must be nasty to Trump." And said mayor of San Juan, Carmen Yulín Cruz, responded by wearing this t-shirt with the word nasty emblazoned across it. According to Rolling Stone magazine, the negligence which Trump heavily brought in his response to Hurricane Maria in 2017 should have served as a warning for the American people. The article recounts, the United States has seen death on this scale before, and it has been ignored before. Carmen Yulín Cruz couldn't. She saw it up close when Hurricanes Irma and Maria devastated the island. Instead of getting the help they needed from Trump, Puerto Ricans got paper towels thrown at them and petty tweets. Later, the president pushed forward with a deliberate, mean-spirited effort to steal aid from the very folks who still need it today. Alcaldesa Carmen Yulín of San Juan tells Rolling Stone that after Hurricane Maria, the United States should have known how Trump would handle this pandemic. She upholds that his disastrous response to Puerto Rico and lack of care for the Puerto Rican people extends to those on the mainland, and that Maria was a prelude to the horrors exacerbated by the Trump administration for COVID-19 response within its borders. Carmen Yulín was a force of sheer will who faced down with the media on multiple occasions in attempts to put a spotlight on Puerto Rico's needs. I heard from her on the news before I heard from my family. Using my experience of watching Hurricane Maria unfold from the mainland, I can say that the aftermath wreaked more havoc than the hurricane. All of my family, except my parents and my sisters, live on the island. When the power grid fell, there was zero communication, and I had no idea how my family was. 3 weeks of radio silence, 3 weeks of not knowing. And while I waited, every day I would hear Trump on the news saying that everything was perfect in Puerto Rico. Everything was not fine in Puerto Rico. I heard him use the same rhetoric of denial during this pandemic. And just like Maria, people are going to pay for it with their lives. Puerto Rico was easily written off because many Americans don't see it as a part of the US. Instead of Hurricane Maria being a moment of solidarity, like Hurricane Harvey in Texas, the US treated it like a Puerto Rican problem. This is because of the othering Puerto Ricans have faced throughout history. It's easy to ignore cuando no son de los tuyos, as in when they are not one of yours. Puerto Ricans were and are not always welcome because of their racial diversity, their culture, territorial status, the way they speak, and among other things that promote a stratified society. The image on this slide is from a mainland establishment, but the same sentiment can be found in certain areas of Puerto Rico to this day, which have been taken over by tourists. In Vieques, an island adjacent to Puerto Rico, most of the businesses are owned by white Americans who control the markets. When I went with my family, we were almost denied entrance to a restaurant, which the locals are not allowed to dine at. If it weren't for the fact that we spoke English at the door, they would not have let us in. After Hurricane Maria, there was a mass exodus of families, young adults, elderly, and professionals who fled the island. This has caused a scarcity in the island of health professionals, and with a high aging population who are most at risk for coronavirus, the picture painted is not pretty. This has caused an increase of numbers in the diaspora, which I find myself a part of. But my parents moved to the mainland because they were looking for economic opportunity out of the island to support their family, something they had attempted to achieve in Puerto Rico. After Maria and during this pandemic, the people leaving the island are being pushed out to an extent. They have been through hurricanes, earthquakes, are riding out this pandemic, and on top of that, the economy has taken even more hits. Many are forced to ask themselves, how can I stay? Many, including my family, never wanted to leave. They leave with the hope that one day they will return. As depicted in the image above, many Puerto Ricans migrate to Florida, Texas, and New York. My family first moved to Florida, and then we found ourselves in Texas, and now we live in Indiana. In this photo, you can see my mommy, me, my two sisters, Gabriela and Natalia, before we moved to the mainland US. And this is a photo of my parents when they were dating in college before they got married, Xiomara and Alfredo. During the pandemic, Puerto Rico has remained open for business. Tourists continue to flock to the island for a getaway from the seriousness of COVID-19. Due to the continued flow of incoming and outgoing traffic, the government has campaigned for cooperation with the people. They cater to the tourist population in San Juan, as you can see in the image above that has a banner in English and Spanish, with guidelines of how to keep the community safe. The caricature depicted makes this banner interesting, because it uses a reference to popular culture. The masked figure, which is wearing two masks, one for sanitation reasons and the other to hide an identity, is featured on a hit Spanish TV show called La Casa de Papel. This costume has formed part of many calls of independence and calls to end corruption as well as greed. And now it watches over the people walking through the streets of El Viejo San Juan. The second campaign was produced by El Departamento de Salud, the Department of Health, which's goal was to promote safe sexual activity during the pandemic, but from home by turning to masturbation instead of a partner. The campaign had two easy steps. Step 1: the safest sexual activity during this COVID-19 pandemic is masturbation. Step 2: make sure to wash your hands well and any sex toys you will use before and after you masturbate. Due to public complaints, the campaign was abandoned. Nicola Acevedo writes on Puerto Rico's precarious position during the pandemic in her article, Puerto Rico is going to be ignored during coronavirus pandemic, experts worry. Not only do experts worry, inhabitants and the diaspora who are used to feeling the effects of poor management worry as well. As people continue leaving and entering the island, Gobernadora Wanda Vázquez, who was put in power after Rosselló was forced to resign by the Puerto Rican people, has implemented an island-wide curfew, banned cruise ships, closed schools, and all non-essential businesses. I remember when Trump was saying that COVID was just like the flu, while Puerto Rico was already trying to close up shop. When I talked to my abuela on the phone, she would tell me that there was a mandatory curfew starting at 7 p.m., ending at 5 a.m. And if you were caught after curfew, you could be jailed and fined. While this may seem severe, an island like Puerto Rico has no choice but to go on the offense. The hospitals would not be able to treat all infected if there were a massive spike. Meanwhile, in Indiana, there wasn't even a mask mandate at that point. In Puerto Rico, people were already opening up businesses dedicated to making stylized face masks, which my abuela sent me a few. In addition to the curfew, the gobernadora would like to close the airports, but is prevented to do so without approval from the Federal Aviation Administration. They have yet to hear back. Puerto Ricans fear that this will be worse than Maria and will be the final nail in the coffin for their economy and livelihood. The U.S. ultimately controls whether Puerto Rico can survive this pandemic. While tourists continue to visit the island, Puerto Rico must adapt. The first image on the left reads, SOS, we need food and water. This is an aerial shot that was captured after Hurricane Maria. The second image captures the congestion of families, young adults, and elderly people waiting and sleeping at airports to leave the island. During the pandemic, airlines have added precautions to prevent greater COVID-19 transmissions. They've lowered their ticket prices to promote travel. Andy Meek exposes the disparity in some airfares are so cheap right now, they might as well be free. Airlines are entities that answer to themselves, unless airports are closed, and have the authority to lower their prices in response to the markets as they see fit. They are an industry trying to survive this pandemic, but the government can step in to protect vulnerable regions. They have decided not to. How steadfast is your will when you receive ads for $17 flights? Those are the prices I saw posted at the very beginning of the pandemic. Southwest was promoting fares that started at $49, including Puerto Rico. I see this as further proof of neocolonialism and apathetic capitalism. During Maria, to leave the island, cost of airplane tickets skyrocketed. People were virtually trapped on the island. Families slept at the airport as if waiting for their golden ticket. $1,000 both way to leave, and $49 to come exploit ethnotourism during a pandemic. When it comes to citizenship, the favoritism is undeniable. This stark difference in ticket prices after Hurricane Maria is further proof of the close ties that exist between capitalism and colonization. This cheapness in ticket prices places the lives of families who couldn't leave to protect their own in Hurricane Maria in extreme danger, as well as everyone who calls Puerto Rico home. Puerto Rico is an embargoed island nation and low on the mainland's list of priorities, as explained in the image above discussing the Merchant Marine Act. It depicts the image of a typical jibaro, which is a mountainside farmer of Puerto Rico, being placated by the US government. Currently, in compounded disasters, Puerto Rico confronts COVID 19 under US colonialism. Garia Lopez does not shy away from the facts. Puerto Rico has minimal PPE, poor infrastructure, high percentage of vulnerable populations, and little to no aid forthcoming. I have experienced most of these hardships secondhand. I was not with my family for Hurricane Maria or Irma. I was with my family when the earthquakes, which are still going on, began. I am unable to be with my family during this pandemic. As a Puerto Rican who is part of the diaspora and moved to the mainland at a young age, I have been exposed to the history that isn't taught in PR, my history. It is one of a nation who has never known self autonomy and is to this day restrained and exploited under the name of territory, which is a more neutral term for colony. I know this is not the last disaster Puerto Rico will face. So when I vote this election, as I will vote every year to come, I vote for my family in Puerto Rico who is denied that right, so that one day I may walk on its shores as a sovereign state. Puerto Rico is the world's oldest colony, and it is my home. During this pandemic, Puerto Rico is still juggling Hurricane Maria recovery, hurricane season, earthquakes, an immense national debt, and a turbulent political atmosphere. Though precautions have been put in place, its status is a direct detriment to their COVID 19 response. Tourists and Puerto Ricans continue to visit the island, and Puerto Rico has no choice but to let them in. Its categorization as other has had deadly consequences in the past, and it seems that the narrative might carry over in this pandemic. My Hometown in Pandemic project addresses the atmospheres of the pandemic, but what it reveals are the issues that have always existed right under the surface. The final image will be one of hope and persistence. So I say, Liberación ya, freedom now. Con mucho, mucho amor. Para mi familia y mi isla. Gracias.